Okay, so, and then I'm going to mute everybody
Bye for now.
so we don't get too much interruptions. Now, Marjorie wanted to start off with some discussion, so we will let Marjorie start.
And what prompted that again?
You asked us to start.
I know, but I forget what we were.
Well, I can't.
Give it away.
I don't know what you were thinking. I mean, I can give you some time to do it because I decided to just change this thing. I've been reading a biography of John von Neumann, who is one of the really seminal mathematicians in the 20th century and had incredible impact everywhere. The thing that everyone would recognize him for would be that he came up with the actual, I will call it, architecture or system specifications for our computers. So the computers that you have in your phones and in your PCs are all called von Neumann architecture because he actually did the pioneering work on all of these things and then ended up giving it to IBM, and IBM turned it into the 650, which became the first vacuum tube computer IBM did, then a 704, 709, 7094, and then IBM went into the 360 and 370.
And say what the time frame was.
And these were, but they're all, even today, everything that Intel does, you name it, is all based on the ideas of von Neumann, okay? The other thing that you would know him for, though, is that he did the fundamental work on the atomic bomb, and in particular, how to make sure that when everything came together, when you actually pulled the trigger and expected to have the materials fission, so that you ended up with throwing in one neutron and getting two neutrons back, and then the two neutrons gave you four neutrons back, and it cascaded into a chain reaction that led to what happened over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was due to von Neumann. He led the work at Los Alamos in doing this. But anyway, I have a little video here of him that I found, which captures. He's very different than other people. He was, as you'll see, born in Budapest in Hungary, and anybody that knew him immediately recognized that he was incredibly brilliant. Anybody, okay? And the classic example that people cite is Edward Teller. Edward Teller, who actually was also at Los Alamos, came up with the design for the atomic bomb, and von Neumann showed him that it couldn't work, okay? That's who von Neumann was, okay? And then Teller came up with the idea for a hydrogen bomb, which is fusion, not fission. You need fission to start it, but then you need it to fuse the elements together. And again, Teller failed, but von Neumann with Stan Ulam fixed that, so that led to the fusion or hydrogen bomb. So with that as a background, Teller remembers one day watching von Neumann talk to a 3-year-old, one of the children of one of his friends. And Teller said, well, he watched von Neumann, and von Neumann carried on this wonderful conversation with this 3-year-old. And the only thing going through Teller's mind was, that's probably how he talks to all the rest of us. So let's take a look at this and you'll see why. Hold on one sec, I gotta do the share screen thing.
But what were you going to do about Jung?
Then we're gonna go to Jung. I'm giving Marjorie time
To remember
to
what
remember.
I was going to say, but just give me about the golden flower.
Well, that's,
I guess I have to write everything down, but then I can't read it.
hold on. Here it is. So this is just a digression to get us going. Well, Marjorie composes everything. So here we go.
Notable. John von Neumann was a 20th century Hungarian-American mathematician and physicist. He is considered to be the last representative of the great mathematicians, integrating both the pure and applied sciences. Von Neumann contributed remarkable work to many fields, which included the foundations of mathematics, functional analysis, topology and statistics, quantum mechanics, hydrodynamics, and nuclear physics, contributing heavily to the creation of the first atomic bomb via the Manhattan Project in World War II, as well as on the hydrogen bomb after, game theory, self-replicating machines, and stochastic computing. He published over 150 papers, with about 120 being in mathematics, 20 being in physics, and the remainder being on a mixture of non-mathematics and special mathematical subjects. Von Neumann was born on December 28, 1903, in Budapest, Hungary, which at that time was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was given the name Neumann János Lajos and was born to a wealthy, acculturated, non-observant Jewish family. He also had two younger brothers, Michael and Nicholas. His father was Neumann Miksha, a banker who held the doctorate in law and had moved to Budapest from Pécs in the late 1880s. His mother was Margaret Kahn, who came from a wealthy family living in large apartments above the Kahn-Heller offices. Von Neumann's family actually lived on the top floor of this building in an 18-room space. Both his parents were highly intellectual, so it's no surprise that they had a massive private library in this apartment. On February 20th, 1913, Miksha paid a small fee to acquire a title of nobility for his family name, being able to do so only because of his service to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Miksha ended up not changing his name, but of course von Neumann decided to. At first he was Margitai Neumann János, but later decided to use the German name we know today, John von Neumann. In 1911, von Neumann entered the Fachschule Evangelikos Gymnasium. The school was considered to be one of the best in Budapest, being part of a very rich school system that churned out pioneers of the 20th century, known as the Martians, which included Leo Szilard, a Hungarian German-American physicist notable for conceiving of nuclear chain reaction in 1933, Paul Erdős, a Hungarian mathematician who is considered one of the most prolific mathematicians of the 20th century, focusing heavily on previously open problems, Paul Halmos, a Hungarian-American mathematician notable for making fundamental advances in many areas of mathematics, including logic and probability theory, and Eugene Wigner, a 20th century theoretical physicist, notable for receiving a Nobel Prize for his contributions to the theory of atomic nucleus and the elementary particles. Wigner attended the same school as von Neumann and was 1 year ahead. They soon became friends and would remain so for the rest of von Neumann's life. At age 15, von Neumann's father hired mathematician Gabor Szegő, notable for making fundamental contributions to the theory of orthogonal polynomials, to teach von Neumann advanced calculus. Szegő was apparently brought to tears with how talented von Neumann was, as any problem Szegő proposed was apparently solved immediately. In 1921, at age 19, von Neumann published two major papers, the second one being most notable, as it provided the definition we use today for ordinal numbers. The same year, he graduated from the Gymnasium, receiving the Utvush Prize, a national prize in mathematics. Due to the fears his father had about the financial limitations of mathematics, von Neumann was being pushed towards industry, thereby would have been investing his time in more financially useful endeavors in his father's eyes. Mathematician Theodor von Karman, notable for his contributions to aeronautics, was asked to persuade von Neumann not to take up mathematics as a major. It was decided chemical engineering could be lucrative, but seeing as von Neumann had no knowledge in chemistry, it was arranged for him to take a 2-year non-degree course in the subject at the University of Berlin, before ultimately sitting for and passing the entrance exam at ETH Zurich in September 1923. It must be noted that von Neumann was also studying mathematics at the University of Budapest alongside his studies at the University of Berlin, though he never attended the lectures, which proved to be no problem as he passed all of his exams with flying colors. The same year he began attending Pazman Pater University. It should come as no surprise then that he actively sought out mathematics in Zurich, interacting with people such as Hermann Weyl, a mathematician and physicist notable for his contributions to number theory, and George Polya, a mathematician notable for making fundamental contributions to combinatorics and probability theory. Polya was immensely impressed with von Neumann, apparently saying, "Johnny was the only student I was ever afraid of. If in the course of a lecture I stated an unsolved problem, the chances were he'd come to me at the end of the lecture with the complete solution scribbled on a slip of paper." Von Neumann presented his PhD thesis in 1925, the topic being on the axiomatization of Cantor's set theory, and he received his degree in chemical engineering from Zurich in 1926. After graduating, he then went off to the University of Göttingen to study under David Hilbert, per a grant provided by the Rockefeller Foundation. At the end of 1927, von Neumann had published 12 major mathematics papers, and at the end of 1929, he'd published 32. He'd also begun lecturing at the University of Berlin in 1928 under the title of Privatdozent, which granted him permission to teach subjects at the highest possible level, and he was the youngest the university had ever elected to that title in their history. The following year, in 1929, von Neumann ended up at the University of Hamburg as a Privatdozent, as the prospects of being a tenured professor were higher. This was very brief, as he was offered a position at Princeton that October, so he ended up moving to America, but he still held academic posts in Germany until 1933. While lecturing at Princeton from 1930 to 1933, it was expressed that his students had a difficult time following his mathematical explanations, largely because he was a speed demon, but apparently he was crystal clear when teaching physics. Going a bit deeper into his contributions over the next few years, we'll first take a step back and discuss his PhD thesis. The 1925 paper demonstrated two techniques to exclude sets that are sets of themselves. The first is the axiom of regularity, which states that every non-empty set A contains an element that is disjoint from A. And the second is the notion of class, a class being a collection of sets that can be unambiguously defined by a property that all its members share. The arguments made with these techniques patched up contradictions that arose in earlier set theoretic systems, like Russell's paradox, which is stated as follows. Let a set R be defined as X such that X does not belong to itself. Then we have that R belongs to itself if and only if R does not belong to itself. In 1928, von Neumann basically kicked off game theory with his proof of the minimax theorem, which, in game theoretic terms, established that in zero-sum games with perfect information, there exists a pair of strategies for both players that allows each to minimize his maximum losses. He showed minimaxes are equal in absolute value and contrary by sign. Later on, von Neumann expanded upon the theorem to also account for games lacking perfect information and to account for games with greater than 2 players. This expansion can be found in the 1944 work, Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, authored by both von Neumann and Oskar Morgenstern, a 20th century economist notable for co-founding game theory with von Neumann. In this work, it is declared that economic theory needed to use functional analysis rather than traditional differential calculus, emphasizing heavy use of methods found in differential topology. In 1932, von Neumann made foundational contributions to ergodic theory, which is the study of invariant measures in dynamical systems. An invariant measure being a measure that is preserved by some function. Paul Mosch wrote that if von Neumann's only contributions to mathematics had been these series of papers, there would have been plenty to provide mathematical immortality. The same year, von Neumann published Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics, It was the first work to establish a rigorous mathematical framework for quantum, which are coined the Dirac von Neumann axioms. He began work on this axiomatization after his PhD thesis, realizing in 1926 the state of quantum mechanics could be represented by a point in a complex Hilbert space that generally could be infinite dimensional, even for a single particle. In von Neumann's formalization of quantum, observable quantities such as position or momentum are represented as linear operators acting on the Hilbert space associated with the quantum system. Thus, the physics of quantum mechanics was reduced to the mathematics of Hilbert spaces and linear operators acting upon them. A prime example of this is the uncertainty principle, which is the principle according to which the determination of the position of a particle prevents the determination of its momentum and vice versa. Von Neumann's formalization translated this into non-commutativity of the two corresponding operators. This abstract treatment permitted him to also confront the foundational issue of determinism versus non-determinism, presenting a proof that the statistical results of quantum could not possibly be averages underlying a set of determined hidden variables, contrary to classical statistical mechanics. This proof launched a line of research that ultimately led to the demonstration that quantum mechanics either requires the notion of reality in a substantially different way from that of classical physics, or must include non-locality in an apparent violation of special relativity. Non-locality being the phenomenon by which the measurement statistics of a multipartite quantum system do not admit an interpretation in terms of a local realistic theory. Aside from his contributions to mathematics and physics, von Neumann was one of the founding figures of computing. When Alan Turing visited Princeton in the 1930s, him and von Neumann worked on the philosophy of artificial intelligence together. In 1945, von Neumann wrote a 23-page sorting program for the electronic discrete variable automatic computer in ink, which is referred to as the merge sort algorithm, where the first and second halves of an array are each sorted recursively and then merged. Von Neumann made strides in simulation theory, developing simulations on his digital computers for hydrodynamic computations when working on the hydrogen bomb. He ended up contributing heavily to the development of the Monte Carlo method, allowing for solutions of complicated problems to be approximated using random numbers. Due to the issue of producing a set of random numbers being too computationally intensive, von Neumann created one of the earlier methods of pseudo-random number generation via the middle square method. It was criticized as crude, which von Neumann already knew, but he justified it as being faster than any other available method, noting that any problems that arise in generation are clearly visible, contrary to other methods. Von Neumann is considered to be the father of computer virology. He used mathematical analysis for the structure of self-replication, preceding the discovery of DNA structure, creating the field of cellular automata, using a pencil and graph paper to construct the first self-replicating automata. In 1949, this design was used for a self-reproducing computer program and is considered the world's first computer virus. In 1953, von Neumann published a paper that introduced the world to stochastic computing, a collection of techniques that represent continuous values by streams of random bits, reducing complex computations to simple bitwise operations of streams. Though revolutionary, none of his techniques could be implemented at the time due to the limited computing power. It wouldn't be until the 1960s, well after his death, that computing would advance enough. Working on the meteorological program, a project funded by the US Navy in 1946, von Neumann wrote the world's first climate modeling software. This was used to perform the world's first numerical weather forecasts, and the results were published in his 1950 work titled Numerical Integration of the Barotropic Vorticity Equation. His research in weather systems and meteorological prediction led him to propose manipulating the environment by spreading coolants on the polar ice caps to enhance solar radiation, basically inducing global warming. He proposed a theory of global warming as a result of human activity, noting Earth was 6 Fahrenheit colder during the last glacial period. And in 1955, he wrote that carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere by industries burning with coal and oil, more than half of it during the last generation, may have changed the atmosphere's composition sufficiently to account for a general warming of the world by about 1 degree Fahrenheit. He urged caution in any program of intentional human weather manufacturing, emphasizing it could be done, but questioned whether it should be done. During the 1930s, von Neumann had developed an expertise in explosions, which were notoriously difficult to model mathematically. He was a leading authority at the time of the mathematics of shaped charges, landing him many military consultancies, primarily with the Navy. Ultimately, this led him to the Manhattan Project, the program beginning in the late 1930s that produced the world's first nuclear weapons. His role was pivotal, as he actually made the most important contribution to the bomb that was eventually dropped on Nagasaki, coined Fat Man. He came up with the concept and design of explosive lenses needed to compress the plutonium core of the bomb. Working on the Manhattan Project, von Neumann had to take frequent trips by train to secret research facilities at the Los Alamos Laboratory in a remote part of New Mexico. On a visit in September 1944, von Neumann showed that the pressure increase from an explosion shock wave reflection from solid objects was greater than previously believed if the angle of incidence of the wave is between 90 degrees and some limiting angle. Thus, the effectiveness of an atom bomb is greatly increased with detonation some kilometers above the designated target, rather than at ground level. Because of how significant von Neumann's contributions were, him and a few other scientists were chosen as members of a target selection committee with various military personnel. The mission being to choose which Japanese cities to have as the first targets of the atom bomb. Von Neumann oversaw the computations related to expected size of the bomb blasts, estimation of death tolls, and the optimal distance above the ground at which bombs should be detonated. On July 16, 1945, von Neumann was one of the eyewitnesses of the first ever test of an atom bomb detonation, codenamed Trinity. The testing site was about 35 miles southeast of Socorro, New Mexico. Less than a month later, on August 9th, is when Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki. After the war ended, von Neumann continued his work without issue, working with Klaus Fuchs on further development of the hydrogen bomb project. Him and Fuchs filed a secret patent in 1946 titled Improvement in Methods and Means for Utilizing Nuclear Energy, outlining the scheme for using a fission bomb to compress fusion fuel to initiate nuclear fission. Fuchs ended up passing on this work to the Soviets as part of his nuclear espionage, though it ended up not being used by the Soviets as it didn't seem to be understood that well until after the creation of the hydrogen bomb by the Teller-Ulam design. For his contributions during wartime services, in 1946, von Neumann was awarded both the Medal for Merit and the Navy Distinguished Civilian Service Award. As is quite well known, the Cold War began about 2 years after World War II ended. Von Neumann is credited with developing the equilibrium strategy of mutually assured destruction to ensure the war stayed cold. Mutually assured destruction entailed that if one side attacked, the other side would attack and both sides would be destroyed. Von Neumann's goal was to quickly develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, as well as compact hydrogen bombs that they could deliver to the USSR. He knew the Soviets were doing similar work, as the CIA gathered intel from German rocket scientists who were allowed to return to Germany. Being afraid of a missile gap, von Neumann made sure the US and allies were quite a few steps ahead of the Soviets. There was initial speculation over his concerns about the Soviets, but they were quickly dismissed due to the Sputnik crisis, which was mass hysteria of a perceived technological gap between the US and Russia, kicking off when the Soviets launched the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1. Considering all the work von Neumann did with the military, he clearly had strong political views. He entered government work primarily because he felt that the only way for freedom and civilization to survive was having the United States triumph over totalitarian Nazism, fascism, and Soviet communism. He described his ideology as violently anti-communist and much more militaristic than the norm. And he is quoted as saying, If you say, why not bomb the Soviets tomorrow? I say, why not today? If you say today at 5 o'clock, I say, why not 1 o'clock? In 1937, von Neumann became a naturalized citizen of the US. He immediately tried to become a lieutenant in the US Army's Reserve Corps, but was ultimately rejected because of his age, despite stellar exam scores. By 1939, much of von Neumann's immediate family had moved to the US as well. It was at this point that von Neumann began using the first name John instead of Janos, but still kept von. Von Neumann married Marietta Kövesi on January 1st, 1930, a woman who he'd met at the University of Budapest while she studied economics. They had a daughter together in 1935 named Marina, who's now a distinguished professor of business administration and public policy at the University of Michigan. Alas, the marriage between von Neumann and Marietta was short-lived. They divorced in 1937. Von Neumann remarried fast, marrying Clara Don in 1938, a woman who he'd met during one of his last trips back to Budapest prior to the outbreak of World War II. Him and Clara were very social in the local academic community, which was especially helped by them throwing many huge parties at their Princeton home, parties which were claimed to be famous and long. Von Neumann seemed to do his best work when it was wildly noisy. When he would work at home, he preferred to work in the living room while his wife watched very loud television, never using a quiet study that Clara had prepared for him. When he worked in his Princeton office, he would often blast loud German march music on his gramophone, receiving many complaints from those in offices neighboring his, including that of Albert Einstein. Despite how intelligent von Neumann was, he was quite reckless with his driving. To give an extreme example, he loved to read while at the wheel. He was arrested a handful of times and had a few accidents. Cuthbert Hurd, the man who hired von Neumann as a consultant for IBM, discreetly paid off many of his fines. For the majority of his life, von Neumann was agnostic, despite being baptized as Catholic in 1930 after his father died the year prior. One could argue he was agnostic until the day he died, but it appears he tried to dig into Catholic faith a bit once he had to truly process his own mortality. He had a consultation with a Catholic priest named Father Anselm Streetmatter, which didn't seem to actually help him process, but von Neumann is stated as saying, "So long as there is the possibility of eternal damnation for non-believers, it is more logical to be a believer at the end." He apparently said to his mother, too, that there probably has to be a God. Many things are easier to explain if there is than if there isn't. In 1955, von Neumann was diagnosed with cancer, the cancer being either bone, pancreatic, or prostate. The realization of his own death, and so soon, greatly affected him, instilling great fear. A breakdown of his reaction to his own mortality is quoted as follows from Legendi and Sentivani's book, Life and Work of John von Neumann. His mind, the amulet on which he had always been able to rely, was becoming less dependable. Then came complete psychological breakdown, panic, screams of uncontrollable terror every night. His friend Edward Teller said, "I think that von Neumann suffered more when his mind would no longer function than I have ever seen any human being suffer." Von Neumann's sense of invulnerability, or simply the desire to live, was struggling with unalterable facts. He seemed to have a great fear of death until the last. No achievements and no amount of influence could save him now, as they always had in the past. Johnny von Neumann, who knew how to live so fully, did not know how to die. Despite any mental decline from the cancer, his mind was still surprisingly powerful on his deathbed, with a prime example being him reciting a few lines of each page from memory of Gould's Faust to his brother for entertainment. Von Neumann died on February 8, 1957, at the age of 53, at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C., under military security, in the off chance that he revealed any military secrets while heavily medicated. His burial took place at the Princeton Cemetery in Princeton, Mercer County, New Jersey. Well, there you have it, a glimpse into the life of John von Neumann. I end on a quote from Miklos Radai. Seems fair to say that if the influence of a scientist is interpreted broadly enough to include impact on fields beyond science proper, then John von Neumann was probably the most influential mathematician who has ever lived. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll catch you next time.
So there is just a interlude to expose you to John von Neumann. For example, a lot of the work that they just touched on with game theory, a significant fraction of the Nobel Prizes in economics that have been awarded have to do with elaborations on those ideas that von Neumann came up with in the context of modern economics. So it just goes on and on what his impact was. So with that, we're going to go back and try and finish up Jung. The thing that I had picked up on was there's just so much to Jung that we haven't even covered here, and one of the things that I mentioned to Marjorie today was that in the 1940s and after World War II and going into the early 1950s, there were a huge number of unidentified flying objects, UFO sightings, just all over the place. And Jung reacted to this by writing on it, okay? And so we have a little video on this so you can see, what in the world he was thinking, and how that related to his notions of archetypes, and what Jung thought of this. So let me just try and pull this up, which is, hold on one sec.
Something I dredged up from my general memory was that Jung had said that it wasn't relevant to whether they actually exist or not. But his archetypal view of the preoccupation with aliens and seeing them as a potential source of salvation was especially initially how a lot of people saw them. Rather than with fear, they saw them with hope of rescue. And so Jung felt that they were a kind of a modernization of the archetype of angels, and that people were looking to aliens, whether they exist or not, as a similar kind of transcendent life form to angels, whether angels exist or not. But that maybe a lot of our ancient images around angels were actually the same archetype. Maybe they were aliens. There's a lot in ancient artwork from Egypt and this continent that seems to depict alien visitations and events and technology that it doesn't have any other ready explanation. So that was something that I just remembered from my previous acquaintance with his thoughts and ideas.
Okay, so here we go. We'll take a look at what's going on here.
To Jung, the self is the penultimate part of the individuation process, where unconscious and conscious coincide. This is represented by the merging of anima and animus, as well as the shadow aspects of one's ego. The self is often symbolized by the Buddhist and Hindu mandala, or magic circle, representing totality and unity. To quote Jung, the mandala is an archetypal image whose occurrence is attested throughout the ages. It signifies the wholeness of the self. For Jung, the unconscious is that which is unknown to us, or alien or other, represented by a
Isn't it
sense
that
of
one?
outsideness, but more from an immanent as opposed to transcendental manner. Why we see so many instances of UFO sightings to Jung is that the unified self has been splintered into numerous multiplicities and pluralities. Thus, we see psychic projections of UFO sightings being an instance of individuals attempting to access the unconscious by way of the alien or other, projecting out or represented it as a flying saucer, since it mimics closely to the psychic model of the mandala or unified self. The aliens and saucers we see stem from our unconscious, which is attempting to unify all of the multiplicities and pluralities of the psychic self. We use the alien as a representative for this since there is no current image or way to categorize or even perceive of the collective totality of the entire human psyche. To quote Jung from his work Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies, a number of UFOs appear. Recalling the first commentary, we could say that the unity of the self as a supraordinate, semi-divine figure has broken up into a plurality. On a mythological level, this would correspond to a plurality of gods, godmen, demons, or souls. In Hermetic philosophy, the arcane substance has 1,000 names, but essentially it consists of the one and only, i.e. God. And this principle only becomes pluralized through being split up. Multiplicatio. The alchemists were consciously performing an opus divinum, in that they sought to free the soul in chains, i.e., to release the demiurge distributed and imprisoned in his own creation and restore him to his original condition of unity. Jung goes on to state, from the psychological point of view, however, the plurality of UFOs would correspond to the projection of a plurality of human individuals. The choice of symbol, spherical object, indicating that the content of the projection is not the actual people themselves, but rather their ideal psychic totality, not the empirical man as he knows himself to be from experience, but his whole psyche, the conscious contents of which have still to be supplemented by the contents of the unconscious. The plurality of UFOs, then, is a projection of a number of psychic images of wholeness which appear in the sky because on the one hand they represent archetypes charged with energy, and on the other hand are not recognized as psychic factors. The reason for this is that our present-day consciousness possesses no conceptual categories by means of which it could apprehend the nature of psychic totality. In other words, the rounded wholeness of the mandala becomes a spaceship, controlled by an intelligent being. So, are aliens and UFOs real? Yes, but in the sense of a shared psychic phenomenon, where we attempt to unify the self through incorporation of the unconscious. Where do aliens originate? Ultimately, they originate within us. We are the alien, and the alien is us. When we look out to the stars, perhaps the gray men and the saucers in which they soar are just separate personas and sides of our yet to be incorporated unconscious.
Okay, so there's a whole bunch of things we're just going to hop around.
That does not represent the totality of what Jung wrote or thought
No,
about the subject.
it's just a snippet of what we were able to find here. Let's just go to give you some other things. Let's see, this one is a little long. Let's see. We did touch on the golden flower last time, and this is there's a number of these videos. Let's look at this one.
We didn't do it this week, but Judith, we especially would like to have input from you because of your interest in Edgar Cayce.
Right.
So we're sorry we didn't prepare a better segue.
Why is there no sound?
someone sent me a copy of The Secret of the Golden Flower, and I can't
Can you hear
have it
this?
any longer because it's worn out. It's
I
like
know,
my Bible my
it's on
father
the,
gave me when I
I
was a
know.
kid. It's worn. The pages are falling out, and I
We
was
just
bad,
hope.
so forth. So I can't even use it. I read it, and I didn't understand it, but it intrigued me. And I began to look at it again and again. And as I read it from time to time, and I read it a little bit at a time, looking at it, I discovered that I was able to understand it only in proportion to the experiences that I had in prayer and meditation. It made sense only when I began to experience some of the material that is presented there, and as I began to understand it. Then I discovered that Earth had an attraction. I don't know what else to call it, a feeling about The Secret of the Golden Flower. And we began to talk about it. And then we agreed that a good thing to try to do would be to talk about it in public, where we could be questioned and where there could be ongoing discussion. And so we've been doing it from time to time, not every year, but frequently here. And I think we could both safely say that we come out of it with a much better understanding of it ourselves. He and I were talking just for a few minutes. We went for lunch the other day to talk about it. But I went upstairs this morning and he was looking at the material, and I said, Herb, I have the same experience with this that I have with The Search for God. Every time I work through it, The Search for God, I find out something in it that I hadn't seen before. Somebody's put something in there that I didn't know was there. The Secret of the Golden Flower is like that. It opens up. In my mind, this is the closest thing that I have read anywhere in all the material I've ever read on meditation to the approach that Edgar Casey made with the massive amount of meditation material that he gave through the years and the recommendations that he made to people about. This is why, of course, it strongly appeals to me, but it's in the working with it. And I think you're going to discover this in your own, if you haven't already, and some of you will not, your life with meditation. You're going to get very quickly the impression that we think meditation is just about as important as breathing. You can't live very well, very safely, or very sanely in these times, particularly, without it. I've got some opening things, but you go on this thing first, I think.
Well, many years ago, I heard Hugh Lim make just the statement that he made just now, that this material was the closest that he had seen anywhere to the approach to meditation that's given in the reading. And so on that basis, I became interested in trying to look at it and reflect upon it. A number of years ago, I was talking on meditation, and I mentioned The Secret of the Golden Flower. But by the way, about a year ago, someone said she had never heard me give a lecture that I didn't mention The Secret of the Golden Flower. But afterwards, one of our enthusiasts came up and said, when you mentioned Secret of the Golden Flower, I just closed my ears because I want to hear what Edgar Casey says about meditation. Well, what Edgar Casey says is we learn by comparison. And as we began to look at things from different perspectives, it's not so much a question of is that right or wrong that we're reading, but rather what happens inside of us. As we look at meditation from one point of view and then from another, something can take place of a quickening of awareness. And as we have our own personal experiences and then see it written down, as Shaban says in the Prophet, our ears long to hear the knowledge of our hearts. And so we like to see something well articulated that reinforces our personal experience. And this happens as we begin to look at this text. Another fascinating reason for looking deeply at this is that the best scholarship seems to indicate that it had, although it was written 700 AD, hundreds and hundreds of years ago in China, it had Christian background stimulation. There were a known group of Nestorian Christians in China at the time. And so many of the references in this text sound like the Gospel of John, with the references to light and water and so on, that there's good reason to believe that there was that influence in the preparation of this material. Then further, as we look at it from a Jungian point of view of archetypes of the collective unconscious, begin to see the same patterns appear in this text that appear in the Edgar Casey readings that were given hundreds of years later from such an entirely different background. And we find these same principles in Tibetan Buddhism and other approaches. Then the comparative study really begins to be worthwhile.
In the very opening of this book, if you look at in the translator's preface, right in the beginning, written by Baylis, there's a statement on page 9 there that has several pertinent remarks for me in it. We're spending a lot of time these days, all of us, all of our speakers, talking about how to live in times of change. We're all in the midst of it. And some of those changes that are taking place are beautifully expressed here in the second sentence. The reshaping of values in progress today forces the modern man out of a nursery world of collective traditions into an adult world of individual choice. You hear us say, you hear me say, you probably have heard say it again and again. As you work consistently with meditation, the will is one of the beautiful things that begins to be strengthened. Move down a few pages, yet it is precisely the need of understanding himself in terms of change and renewal which most grips the imagination of modern man, the understanding of self. Again, does he not contain within his psyche, and this is one of the thrusts of Carl Jung's excellent commentary on this Secret of the Golden Cloud, contain within his psyche a store of unexplored forces, which if rightly understood, would give him a new vision of himself and help safeguard the future for him. Now, if you move with me to page 4 quickly, there are 4 statements of the purposes of this book, and they are outlined there, one right after another, and any one of them I think you would find meaningful. What's the book for? What is it proposed to do for us? A sure method of obtaining definite psychic experience is available. Move down, number 2, use this, I'm on page 4, a discussion of the text. Use this release by meditation for the purpose of seeking the Buddhist nirvana. These are the purposes that these scholars that put this thing together were working with as this man sees it. One can prepare for the possibility of life after death. And the 4th one, exerts a psychic influence on certain processes of the sympathetic nervous system. We speak of this as Europeans, the endocrine glandular system, which you've got a chart of, and meditation from education's point of view is entirely about. And goes on, strengthens, rejuvenates, and normalizes the life process. That's a big order for one little book. But here's what these scholars felt that it was trying to say to the Chinese students many centuries ago.
Let's turn to page 21, the first page of the text. The Chinese have a way of writing, putting the whole central truth right up front. Instead of developing an argument and then finally a conclusion that contains it, it's right there from the beginning. So paragraph 1 has it all. Let's read it. Master Lu Tzu said, that which exists through itself is called the way, or the Tao. Now, from this day forward, you don't pronounce the T, it's as though with a D, all right? No one hesitates to do it. We all know what we're talking about. Tao has neither name nor shape. It is the one essence, the one primal spirit. Essence and life cannot be seen. They are contained in the light of heaven. The light of heaven cannot be seen. It is contained in the 2 eyes. Today, I will be your guide and will first reveal to you the secret of the golden flower of the great one. And starting from that, I will explain the rest in detail. Now, if you're a student of the Agakisi reading, a dozen associations should have crossed your mind as you read those sentences. And we feel this sentence is worth examining carefully because you see, back in those days, there were no printing presses. There were no Xerox machines. There's no mass producing of things. So there was the scarcity of paper and the ability to reproduce that. And of course, the text is actually written down in print in the 1700s, but it's known to have originated back in the 700s. So the oral tradition has it this way. You memorize a sentence, and that sentence becomes the key for a whole sermon. And you, just by having that key, then you have your sermons in sequence. And it is not only fair, but appropriate to the tradition to take that sentence and examine the richness of it. So we can take the sentence, that which exists through itself is called the way, the Tao. Now that's the primal being. What does the reading say about this? If we started the discourse on the reading, it would say the first premise is the oneness of all force. And so we are saying exactly the same thing. The oneness of all force. There is only one force. And that is a truth so important that we will do well to reflect upon it again and again and again. There's hardly a question you can ask that isn't enriched by or enlightened by bringing the concept of oneness to it. Any decision you have to make, any confusion you have, if you say, what is the principle of oneness guidance, then it is enriched. Thou has neither name nor shape. It's like the Bible says in the story of Genesis, the earth was without form and void. Now, in Buddhism, the void is not empty. The void is not empty. It's talking about that beyond materiality, that doesn't have projection or the form as we think of it, but it's the real place, the one essence, the one primal spirit. Essence and light cannot be seen. They are contained in the light of heaven. The light of heaven cannot be seen. It's contained in the two eyes. Now, immediately, we're into physiology, aren't we? Why so much consideration? No, eyes are not physiology. Why so much consideration of the body? People think of meditation as spiritual practice, and they say, let's all that talk about glands and thoughts, that's not important. Let's talk about the spirit. Well, let me define meditation from the point of view of the reading. Meditation is attuning the physical and the mental to the spiritual. Now, let's focus on what we're actually doing, attuning the physical and attuning the mental. Now, we need to know something about that attuning process. Then the spirit can naturally flow. Comments on this, Hugh?
This oneness is, as Herb says, essential philosophic point of view of the reading. It runs right on through, just again and again and again, it's brought up. In one place where there is stress on the ideals, particularly, that speaks of not to separate in your mind the mind and the body and the soul. For in the sight of God, they are one. Now, this is a big jump for us, because we not only split ourselves up, but we split forces within us up and think of them as different, rather than having one energy, one source, one origin. So this oneness cannot be overstressed here. The oneness of the ideal, of running it through every aspect of our being, physical, mental, and spiritual. It's hard for us to separate this thing that we've created. And many of you begin to argue with yourself at this point. There's more than one of me. I've got this physical that I'm beating up on and trying to, and man's been doing this down through the ages. And this sense of oneness that we need to attain is so important here. It jumps right in, as Herb said. You got the whole thing within the first few pages of this, and it takes the rest of the manuscript begins to work with it.
So the readings define meditation as making synonymous the words attunement and atonement, or at one-ment. The whole idea of attuning is becoming at one with ourselves.
Okay, so there's a short introduction. There's other videos that we have that just take longer to go through the Golden Flower, which Jung viewed as probably his greatest. If he had to do all of his works over again, all the things he did, the Golden Flower was the one he would never touch. So I'll just give you just a short example here. This is running through each of the, I believe there's 8 sections to the Golden Flower.
Is it backwards?
Can everybody see this? This is the secret of the Golden Flower. You can see how thick it is. It's not very thick. It's eminently readable.
And he wrote a wonderful
It was
commentary to the translation by Richard Wilhelm.
Yeah, Wilhelm is the translator for it. Jung did a commentary. That's what we're talking about here. So
And that's the same guy that translated the I Ching.
right. Wilhelm did the I Ching. So let me just do just a little bit of this
necessary to gather
video
together by
here. You'll
means
see
of
what's
breathing
going on.
power. Breathing power easily becomes
I'm just going to go back to the beginning. Here we go.
known as Lu Yan and Lu Guest of the Cavern. It is said that Lao Tzu became one of the 8 immortals using these methods. The ideas have been traced back to Persia and the Zarathustra tradition, and its roots in the Egyptian Hermetic tradition. 1. Heavenly consciousness of the heart. Master Lu Tzu said, That which exists through itself is called meaning, or Tao. Meaning was neither name nor force. It is the one essence, the one primordial spirit. Essence and life cannot be seen. It is contained in the light of heaven. The light of heaven cannot be seen. It is contained in the two eyes. Today I will be your guide and will first reveal to you the secret of the golden flower of the Great One. And starting from that, I will explain the rest in detail. The Great One is the term given to that which has nothing above it. The secret of the magic of life consists in using action in order to achieve non-action. One must not wish to leave out the steps between and penetrate directly. The maxim handed down to us is to take in hand the work on the essence. In doing this, it is important not to follow the wrong road. The golden flower is the light. What color has the light? One uses the golden flower as an image. It is the true power of the transcendent Great One. The phrase, the lead of the water region has but one taste, refers to it. The work on the circulation of light depends entirely on the backward flowing movement, so that the thoughts are gathered together, the place of heavenly consciousness, the heavenly heart. The heavenly heart lies between sun and moon, that is, the two eyes. The Book of the Yellow Castle says, in the field of the square inch of the house of the square foot, life can be regulated. The house of the square foot is the face, the field of the square inch in the face. What could that be other than the heavenly heart? In the middle of the square inch dwells a splendor. In the purple hall of the city of jade dwells the God of utmost emptiness in life. The Confucians call it the center of emptiness. The Buddhists, the terrace of life. The Taoist, the ancestral land, or the yellow castle, or the dark pass, or the space of former heaven. The heavenly heart is like the dwelling place. The light is the master. Therefore, when the light circulates, the powers of the whole body arrange themselves before its throne, just as when a holy king has taken possession of the capital and has laid down the fundamental rules of order, all the states approach with tribute. Or just as when a master is quiet and calm, men servants and maids obey his orders on their own accord, and each does his work. Therefore, you only have to make the light circulate. That is the deepest and most wonderful secret. The light is easy to move, but difficult to fix. If it is allowed to go long enough in a circle, then it crystallizes itself. That is the natural spirit body. This crystallized spirit is formed beyond the 9 heavens. It is the condition which is said in the book of the seal of the heart, silently in the morning thou fliest upward. In carrying out this fundamental truth, you need to seek for no other method, but must only concentrate your thoughts on it. The book Leng Yen says, by collecting the thoughts one can fly and will be born in heaven. Heaven is not the wide blue sky, but the place where the body is made in the house of the creative. If one keeps this up for a long time, there develops quite naturally, in addition to the body, yet another spirit body. The golden flower is the elixir of life, literally, golden ball, golden pill. All changes of spiritual consciousness depend upon the heart. Here is the secret charm, which, although it works very accurately, is yet so fluent that it needs extreme intelligence and clarity, and complete absorption and calm. People without this highest degree of intelligence and understanding do not find the way to apply the charm. People without this utmost capacity for concentration and calm cannot keep fast hold of it. Book 2, The Primordial Spirit and the Conscious Spirit. Master Lu Zhu said, in comparison with heaven and earth, man is like a mayfly, but compared to the great meaning, heaven and earth too are like a bubble and a shadow. Only the primordial spirit and the true essence overcome time and space. The power of the seed, like heaven and earth, is subject to mortality, but the primordial spirit is beyond the polar differences. Here is the place whence heaven and earth derive their being. When students understand how to grasp the primordial spirit, they overcome the polar opposites of light and darkness and tarry no longer in the 3 worlds. But only he who has looked on essence in its original manifestation is able to do this. When men are set free from the womb, the primordial spirit dwells in the square inch between the eyes, but the conscious spirit dwells below in the heart. This lower fleshy heart has the shape of a large peach. It is covered by the wings of the lungs, supported by the liver, and served by the bowels. This heart is dependent on the outside world. If a man does not eat for one day even, it feels extremely uncomfortable. If it hears something terrifying, it throbs. If it hears something enraging, it stops. If it is faced with death, it becomes sad. If it sees something beautiful, it is dazzled. But the heavenly heart in the head, when would it have been in the least moved? Dost thou ask, can the heavenly heart not be moved? Then I answer, how could the true thought in the square inch be moved? If it really moves, it is not well. For when ordinary men die, then it moves, but that is not good. It is best indeed if the light has already fortified itself in a spirit body, and its life force gradually penetrated the instincts and movements. But that is a secret which has not been revealed for thousands of years. The lower heart moves like a strong, powerful commander who despises the heavenly ruler because of his weaknesses, and has seized for himself the leadership of the affairs of state. But when the primordial castle can be fortified and defended, then it is as if a strong and wise ruler sat upon the throne. The two eyes start the light circulating like two ministers at the right and left who support the ruler with all their might. When the ruler in the center is thus in order, all those rebellious heroes will present themselves with lances reversed, ready to take orders. The way to the elixir of life recognizes as supreme magic seed water, spirit fire, and thought earth, these three. What is seed water? It is the true one power, eros, of former heaven. Spirit fire is the light, logos. Thought earth is the heavenly heart of the middle house, intuition. Spirit fire is used for effecting, thought earth for substance, and seed water for the foundation. Ordinary men make their bodies through thoughts. The body is not only the 7-foot-tall outer body. In the body is the anima. The anima, having produced consciousness, adheres to it. Consciousness depends for its origin on the anima. The anima is feminine, the substance of consciousness. As long as this consciousness is not interrupted, it continues to beget from generation to generation, and the changes of form of the anima and the transformations of substance are unceasing. But besides this, there is the animus in which the spirit shelters. The animus lives in the daytime in the eyes. At night, it houses in the liver. When living in the eyes, it sees. When housing itself in the liver, it dreams. Dreams are the wandering of the spirit through all 9 heavens and all the 9 earths. But whoever is dull and moody on waking and chained to his bodily form is fettered by the anima. Therefore, the concentration of the animus is effected by the circulation of the light, and in this way the spirit is protected, the anima subjected, and consciousness is annulled. The method used by the ancients for escaping from the world consisting in burning out completely the slag of darkness in order to return to the purely creative. This is nothing more than a reduction of the anima and a bringing to the perfection of the animus. And the circulation of the light is the magical means of limiting the dark powers and gaining mastery of the anima. Even if the work is not directed toward bringing back the creative, but confines itself to the magical means of the circulation, one returns to the creative. If this method is followed, plenty of seed water will be present of itself. The spirit fire will be ignited, and the thought earth will solidify and crystallize, and thus can the holy fruit mature. The scare.
Okay, so I just wanted to give you a taste of what this is. It goes on, much more, but I wanted to cut over now to, there's a couple of, there's one video we're just going to do here on what is the devil. But before we do that, we're going to do this one. I have to just go up here to get to it. On Jung and religion. Hold on one sec while I get there.
Just a plug, these are all on the
Here we are.
website, by the way.
Here we are.
In his 1994 interview, Dr. Edward Edinger had the following to say about Dr. Carl Jung's relevance to religion. And by that, he meant all the religions in the world. Let me play that section of his interview for you.
What does Jungian psychology have to do with religion? everything. Everything. You see, Jung has demonstrated that the religious function resides in the psyche and is an integral part of human psychology.
Okay, so today I'm going to read to you a chapter of a book that Dr. Edinger wrote, which gives a more thorough explanation of what Dr. Edinger is saying in this video. The book I'm reading from is The Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament. I'm reading from chapter 1. The Bible and the Psyche. Quote, "We must read the Bible or we shall not understand psychology. Our psychology, whole lives, our language and imagery are built upon the Bible." C.G. Jung. This book was published by Inner City Books in 1986. As the 21st century approaches, we are witnessing the emergence of a whole new worldview growing out of depth psychology. This new science studies the psyche as an experienceable, objective phenomenon. It takes old data and approaches them in a new way. For instance, mythology, religion, and sacred scriptures of all kinds are taken out of their traditional contexts and understood psychologically. That is, are seen as the phenomenology of the objective psyche. From this view, the Bible is considered to be a self-revelation of the objective psyche. As Jung says, quote, "The statements made in the Holy Scriptures are also utterances of the soul. They point to realities that transcend consciousness. These entia are the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Heretofore, these transcendent psychic entities have appeared as metaphysical contents of religious dogma, but now," writes Jung, quote, "a scientific psychology must regard those transcendental intuitions that sprang from the human mind in all ages as projections, that is, as psychic contents that were extrapolated in metaphysical space and hypostasized. It is no easy transition from the metaphysical standpoint of religious faith to the empirical standpoint of the psyche. Between these two mountain ridges lies a dark valley, the valley of lost faith, alienation, meaninglessness, and despair. For those who are perched safely on the ridge of religious faith, the psychological approach can be seen as an interesting addition to the more secure viewpoint they already possess. However, for those who, consciously or unconsciously, have already slipped off the ridge of faith and are in the dark valley, the discovery of the psychological approach may just possibly be life-saving. This approach is an admission of spiritual bankruptcy. It is available only to the poor of spirit, for as Jung says, quote, "I am not addressing myself to the happy possessors of faith, but to those many people for whom the light has gone out. The mystery has faded and God is dead. For most of them, there is no going back, and one does not know either whether going back is the better way. To gain an understanding of religious matters, probably all that is left us today is the psychological approach. That is why I take these thought forms that have become historically fixed, try to melt them down again, and pour them into molds of immediate experience." The Old Testament documents a sustained dialogue between God and man as it is expressed in the sacred history of Israel. It presents us with an exceedingly rich compendium of images representing encounters with the numinosum. These are best understood psychologically as pictures of the encounter between the ego and the self, which is the major feature of individuation. The Old Testament is thus a grand treasury of individuation symbolism. These venerable stories derive from countless individual experiences of the numinosum, and their psychic substance has been augmented through the ages by the pious worship and reflection of millions. When these facts are realized, we discover once again that the Old Testament is indeed a holy book. It is quite literally the Ark of the Covenant in which resides the power and glory of the transpersonal psyche. We must therefore approach it with caution, honoring its numinous power. The psychological approach takes the Bible as it is, on the hypothesis that the collective psyche has semi-purposely selected and arranged it over the course of the centuries. While respecting the methods of biblical criticism, the psychological standpoint is not concerned that a particular passage of the Pentateuch comes from the J source rather than the E. Also, the sequence is considered significant. The Hebrew Bible, based on the Masoretic text, 600 to 800, 600 to 900 AD, consists of 24 books gathered into 3 parts: the law, the prophets, and the writings. The arrangement of Old Testament books in the Christian Bible derives from the Greek translation made from 280 to 150 BC. This arrangement emphasizes a linear development process consistent with the historical, time-bound quality of the Western psyche. According to this version, the Old Testament is composed of 39 books, arranged sequentially in 3 categories: 17 historical books, 5 books of wisdom and poetry, and 17 prophetic books shown opposite. I see this arrangement as a balance. On one side are the historical books in which Yahweh deals with Israel collectively as a nation. At this stage, individuation imagery is carried by the nation as a whole, the chosen people. On the other side are the prophetic books, each one named after a great individual who had a personal encounter with Yahweh and was fated to be an individual carrier of God consciousness. In the middle are the poetic wisdom books, with Job at their head. Job is the pivot of the Old Testament story. That is why Jung focused his Bible commentary on Job. Here, for the first time, a man encounters Yahweh as an individual and not as a function of the collective. Similarly, Yahweh did not deal with Job as a representative of Israel, but rather as an individual man. This book thus marks the transition from collective psychology to individual psychology, from group and church religion to the individual's lonely encounter with the numinosum. After Job comes the wisdom literature, as though the individual's encounter with the self has generated wisdom, or, as Jung puts it in answer to Job, as though the demonstration of Job's greater consciousness has obliged Yahweh to remember his feminine counterpart, divine wisdom, Sophia. The events of the Bible, although presented as history, psychologically understood, are archetypal images, pleromatic events that repeatedly erupt into spatio-temporal manifestation and require an individual ego to live them out. As we read these stories with an openness to their unconscious reverberations, we recognize them to be relevant to our own most private experience. We are then reading the Bible the way Emerson tells us to read history. Quote, "The fact narrated must correspond to something in me to be credible or intelligible. We, as we read, must become Greeks, Romans, Turks, priest and king, martyr and executioner, must fasten these images to some reality in our secret experience, or we shall learn nothing rightly. What befell Asdrubal and Caesar Borgia is as much an illustration of the mind's powers and deprivations as what has befallen us. Each new law and political movement has a meaning for you. Stand before each of its tablets and say, quote, under this mask did my Proteus nature hide itself, unquote. This remedies the defect of our great nearness to ourselves. This throws our actions into perspective. And as crabs, goats, scorpion, the balance, and the water pot lose their meanness when hung as signs in the zodiac, so I can see my own vices without heat in the distant persons of Solomon, Alcibiades, and Catiline, unquote. Jung tells us that the book of Job serves as a paradigm for a certain experience of God, which has a special significance for us today. The same can be said of many other contents of the Old Testament. The new insights of depth psychology allow us to relate the mighty mythologems of the Bible to the depth experience of individuals. Christ reinterpreted the Old Testament as foreshadowing of his coming. For instance, speaking to the Emmaus pilgrims, quote, beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Luke 24:27, the authorized version of the King James Bible. So now at the beginning of a new eon, the individual pursuing the process of individuation may now read these scriptures once again to learn, quote, those things concerning himself, unquote. Footnotes. The Emerson quote comes from History, the selected writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson, page 124. Most of the Jung quotes come from Psychology and Religion, Collected Works, volume 11. See Rudolf Otto, The Ideas of the Holy, for a discussion of the concept of the numinous. Now I want to share with you a bit longer excerpt from the Edinger interview from 1994, and I will put a link to the transcript of it with this video. Also, at the end of this video, you will find a listing of the various books of the Old Testament as categorized by Dr. Edinger.
What does Jungian psychology have to do with religion?
Everything. Everything. You see, Jung has demonstrated that the religious function resides in the psyche and is an integral part of human psychology. And that just means that the ego, in order to be healthy, needs to have a living connection to a transpersonal center. But the point is that the human psyche has a religious function in both senses, a need to link back and a need to give careful consideration to the source of his being. And the religious process then is one in which the ego has a living organic connection to a larger whole. And that, of course, is the function that the traditional religions have always served. They've done it by the collective structure and the dogmatic formulations and the whole concept of God and man's relation to God that they provide the believer. They've given the individual a religious container in which he has the sense of being connected to the larger whole. Now, modern man, especially the creative minority of modern man, has lost that connection provided by the traditional religions because they're too concrete. They haven't kept pace with modern man's mental development. So they're not in tune with modern categories of understanding. So the great service that Jung has performed has, by his discovery of the collective unconscious and the archetypes and the self, he's penetrated to the psychological source and basis that underlies all the world religions, and thereby he's verified and redeemed for modern consciousness the validity and reality of the religious operations as they express themselves in all religions. That's been achieved, and I don't think we can appreciate the magnitude of that achievement, because what it means is that the psychological basis has been laid for the realization of a unified world. We've got the basis now for a unification of all the factional divisions among the world religions. It's been accomplished. One man has done it. I wish I could communicate the fact that I see so clearly concerning Jung's discovery of the basis of all the world's religions. He's achieved by this discovery the psychological basis for the unification of the world. It's really a pitiful sight to see the world split up into these separate warring fragments of religious identifications, of nationalistic identifications, of ethnic identifications, all at war with one another. They're all operating out of the energies of connection with the same transpersonal image of wholeness. They are all operating out of their connection to deity, to the self, as it is constellated and perceived within their local context, religious or nationalistic context. It's the same psychic self, and what Jung has done has penetrated to that source. That's the paradoxical God that he talked about. He's seen it, and once he's seen it, it can then no longer split up into these various ethnic and religious factions and fight against itself. One human being has seen the back of God, so to speak. So that means then that he's going to be eventually unified, and the world will be unified politically sooner or later as an inevitable consequence of that that event of human consciousness.
So there you have a summary. I'm just going to do one other thing, and then we're going to have some discussion. But I'm just going to go to, there's this other video down here. What is the devil? Here we go.
Discordianism is founded on the notion of the trickster, first proposed by renowned psychologist Carl Jung, to explain the recurring archetype of the devil and its variations. It represents the attempt to revive what has been interpreted to be the dying god cult.
Yeah. What happened here? Didn't want to.
Oh. It's that one.
Of ancient times, but often coloured by modern interpretation. In other words, the same tradition of the wise fool that eventually inspired the mystic crew.
I'm just going to start this over since we lost something. Hold on. Here we go. Go back to the beginning.
Pause it first.
Pause it.
Yeah.
There it goes. Okay. Hmm? What happened here? It's not happy.
Is it divine interference or demonic interference?
Hold on. I'm gonna have to get out of this. Hold on. Let me go back to. I wonder if we lost on the internet, if we had an internet hit.
No, I think everybody's still there.
Yeah, no, I know.
This page is a big load.
Yeah, when you load these videos, it just takes forever to get them all there. Here we go. Hold on, I'm going to go back to screen share. Almost there. Here we go.
Used by renowned psychologist Carl Jung to explain the recurring archetype of the devil and its variations. It represents the attempt to revive what has been interpreted to be the dying god cults of ancient times, but often colored by modern interpretation. In other words, the same tradition of the wise fool that eventually inspired the mystic crew of commerce. The first to recognize the recurring archetype of the dying and rising god was James Frazer in The Golden Bough, first published in 1890, which has had a substantial influence on European anthropology and thought. Frazer's thesis of the dying god and the sacred king had an immense influence on a large number of authors inspired by the occult, such as Robert Graves, William Butler Yeats, H.P. Lovecraft, Sigmund Freud, James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, D.H. Lawrence, Aleister Crowley, Ezra Pound, and Julius Evola. T.S. Eliot acknowledged indebtedness to Frazer in his first note to his poem, The Waste. And influential was Margaret Murray, the principal theorist of witchcraft as a, quote, pagan survival in the witch cult in Europe. Although modern pagans would deny it, claiming the worship, their, quote, horned god, was ignorantly disparaged by the bigotry of the church. The dying god was universally viewed as a god of evil. Borrowing from Frazer's thesis of the dying god, the, quote, horned god of modern pagans is the lord of the underworld, the sun, while the goddess is the moon. In the Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious by Jung, Jung lists the Feast of Fools as a European adaptation of the trickster archetype. Similarly, Wiccan priestess Margaret Adler in Drawing Down the Moon, which provided the first comprehensive look at modern pagan religions in the US, begins her chapter on Discordianism by mentioning the work of Harvey Cox, who in Feast of Fools, quotes, develops a theory of play, asserting, like others before him, that our society has lost or mutilated the gift of true festivity, playful fantasy, and celebration, end quote. Adler was the granddaughter of Alfred Adler, who collaborated with Freud and founded the Adler Society. She also cites the classic study on play written in 1944 by Johann Huizinga, who wrote that play and ritual was interrelated, and that all sacred rites are performed in the spirit of play. Nothing that, quote, the outlaw, the revolutionary, the Kabbalist, or member of a secret society, indeed heretics, or of a highly associated, if not sociable disposition, with a certain element of play is prominent in all way of doing. However, according to David Carleon, the romantic notion of the daring political jester, which has been popularized over the last few decades, especially since the protests of the 1960s, Carleon concludes that, quote, popular culture embraces a sentimental image of the clown. Writers reproduce that sentimentality in the jester and academics in the trickster, though it, quote, falters as analysis, end quote. As Carleon points out, the trickster cliche is an adaptation of Shakespeare's concept of the jester, and examples of truth-telling fools in The Twelfth Night, As You Like It, and King Lear. Sir Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe, written in 1819, and Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, written in 1889, are two literary examples of the enduring fashion. As Carleon notes, quote, the jester, comic sidekick in that era's medieval mania, was imagined saying to the king that no one else dared say, end quote. According to Carleon, Soviet philosopher Bakhtin's theory of the carnivalesque, to playfully invert social conventions through humor and chaos is another obvious influence. The idea of the carnivalesque originated in Bakhtin's Problem of Dostoevsky's Poets, written in 1929, further developed in Rabelais and His World, written in 1940. Bakhtin traced the origins of the carnivalesque to the concept of carnival, itself related to the Feast of Fools. It was one of the leading situationists, Raoul Vanejan, in his book The Revolution of Everyday Life, written in 1967, who inspired the May 1968 student movement with what could be called carnival liberation theory. Vanejan observed that, quote, a strike for higher wages or a rowdy demonstration can awaken the carnival spirit, end quote. And quote, revolutionary movements are carnivals in which the individual life celebrates its unification with a regenerated society, end quote. Archetypes, according to Jung, are fundamentally human themes found throughout world mythology and are the product of what he calls the collective unconscious. Included motives are the mother, the child, the trickster, and the flood, among others. Reinvented from culture to culture in mythology and folklore, the trickster is presented as God, spirit, man, woman, anthropomorphic animal, supernatural being, or the occasional mischievous fairy who disobey rules and conventional behavior, causing chaos while also inspiring some kind of change to occur. The trickster is a shapeshifter and so has the possibility of transformation. The fool, or the court jester, survives in modern playing cards as the Joker.
Okay, so you're just seeing all the things we missed in terms of trying to cover Jung. The one thing we haven't touched on is discussion on synchronicity. But I think rather than go there, I think this one is this is the final book that Jung wrote before he ended up dying, and let's let him.
Unless he felt it was a task imposed on him from within. Jung had spoken with many great men of his time, but only a few of these occasions remained in his memory. On the other hand, his recollection of inner experiences had grown all the more vivid. This book is the only place in his extensive writings in which Jung speaks of God and his personal experience of God. In his scientific works, he uses the term the God image in the human psyche, based on the objective language. In this case, it is the objective based on inexperience. My life is a story of the self-realization of the unconscious. Everything in the unconscious seeks outward manifestation, and the personality too desires to evolve out of its unconscious conditions to experience itself as a whole. For Jung, life cannot be tackled as a scientific problem, but rather by way of myth, which expresses life more precisely than science. Life has always seemed to me like a plant that lives on its rhizome. Its true life is invisible, hidden in the rhizome. What we see is blossom which passes, the rhizome remains. Jung had a dream around 3 years old that would preoccupy all his life. There was a stone stairway leading down. He started descending it. As he went deeper down, there stood a golden throne, upon which a giant cyclops sat with a single eye gazing upwards. He heard his mother shout out, "That is the man-eater." This represented a subterranean god not to be named, and Jung would think of this underground counterpart as the dark side of Lord Jesus, a frightful revelation which had been accorded to him without him seeking it. In his school years, Jung had an important experience. He had the overwhelming expression of having just emerged from a dense cloud. I knew all at once, now I am myself. It was as if a wall of mist were at my back, and behind that wall there was not yet an eye. But at this moment I came upon myself. Carl Jung experienced two personalities throughout his whole life. Personality number one made up his outer experience, studies, job, responsibilities, as well as his interest in science, while his personality number two made up his inner experience, primarily concerned with his dreams and his interest in psychological and philosophical matters. In his later student years, Jung had to choose whether to study science or the humanities. He experienced two dreams which removed all his doubts in favor of science. One day, he opened up a textbook on psychiatry, preparing for his exams. As he saw the words diseases of the personality, his heart began to pound. Here was the empirical field common to biological and spiritual facts, which I had everywhere sought and nowhere found. Here at last was the place where the collision of nature and spirit became reality. Jung went on to write his first book on the psychology of schizophrenia, and thus began his career in psychiatry. At the core of Jung's psychiatric activities was the burning question: what actually takes place inside the mentally ill? The exploration of conscious material is insufficient, as the ego is only half of one's personality. Jung had to find out how to gain access to the unconscious in order to reach the patient's whole personality. Jung relates the case of one of his patients, an 18-year-old girl who had been abused at an early age and felt humiliated in the eyes of the world, but elevated in the realm of fantasy. She told Jung that she had been living on the moon. The consequence was complete alienation from the world, a state of psychosis. Jung managed to bring her back, anchoring her in reality. Since then, Jung decided to regard the sufferings of the mentally ill in a different light, for he had gained insight into the richness and importance of their inner experience. However, only if the doctor knows how to cope with himself and his own problems will he be able to teach the patient to do the same. The doctor is effective only when he himself is affected. Only the wounded physician heals. Jung was very much influenced by Freud in his early years, and they had a strong relationship. They even analyzed each other's dreams. However, major differences soon arose in their approach to the human psyche. Freud's theory of sexuality as the prime motivational force in man was too one-sided, and Jung began to speak of the instincts of hunger, aggression, and sex as expressions of psychic energy. Jung called his psychology analytical psychology, as distinct from Freud's psychoanalytic theory. After parting ways with Freud, Jung entered a period of inner uncertainty and disorientation. He consciously submitted himself to the impulses of the unconscious. Towards the end of 1913, he was seized by an overpowering vision. He saw thousands of dead bodies, and the whole sea turned to blood. An inner voice spoke. Look at it well. It is wholly real, and it will be so. You cannot doubt it. He had this and other similar visions before the start of the First World War. Philemon and other figures of my fantasies brought home to me the crucial insight that there are things in the psyche which I do not produce, but which produce themselves and have their own life. I observed clearly that it was he who spoke, not I. He said I treated thoughts as if I generated them myself. It was he who taught me psychic objectivity, the reality of the psyche. Philemon represented superior insight and a living personality of Jung's unconscious. He began his confrontation with the unconscious and found out that the archetype of orientation and meaning is the self, represented by mandalas, which one must have a balanced relationship with. Jung had to find evidence for the historical prefiguration of his inner experiences. He studied the Gnostics, for they too had been confronted with the primal world of the unconscious. His encounter with alchemy was decisive. Alchemy formed the bridge on the one hand into the past, into Gnosticism, and on the other into the future, to the modern psychology of the unconscious. Jung felt that he needed to achieve a representation of his inner thoughts apart from books. Thus began the tower, situated at Bollingen. It is the product of 12 years of work, in which he added 4 elements representing a quaternity, a symbol of the self. At Bollingen, I am in the midst of my true life. I am most deeply myself. Jung documents some of his most important travels, some of which include the Pueblo Indians in America, North Africa, and India. He observed that primitive man does what he does. He is led by unconscious impulses, while civilized man knows what he does. He is given over to reflection. While we are more complicated, we lack intensity of life. He observed that for the Pueblo Indians, their religious conceptions are not theories to them, but facts, as important and moving as the corresponding realities. Jung had also traveled to India and was deeply moved. India gave me my first direct experience of an alien, highly differentiated culture. In 1944, Jung suffered from a heart attack and thought he was close to death. He experienced intense visions. He was high up in space and could see the Earth. There was an entrance which led to a temple. It was as if I now carried along with me everything I had ever experienced or done, everything that happened around me. I might also say it was with me and I was it. I consisted of all that, so to speak. I consisted of my own history, and I felt with great certainty, this is what I am. He then saw a vision of his doctor telling him that he must return to Earth. He thought, now I must return to the box system again, for it seemed to me as if behind the horizon of the cosmos, a three-dimensional world had been artificially built up, in which each person sat by himself in a little box. In the day, Jung felt depressed. However, in the night, he was filled with intense visions. It is impossible to convey the beauty and intensity of emotion during those visions. They were the most tremendous things I have experienced. Jung reflects on life after death, stating that man ought to have a myth about death, for reason alone shows him nothing but the dark pit into which he is descending. The sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. In his late thoughts, Jung reflects on the importance of myth in our lives, which cannot be replaced by science. Our conscious life is continuously molded by them, and they are the substratum of our existence. We are not born tabula rasa. I know only that I was born and exist, and it seems to me that I have been carried along. I exist on the foundation of something I do not know. In spite of all uncertainties, I feel a solidity underlying all existence and a continuity in my mode of being.
Okay. So this is our survey of Jung. I think that there's other videos on the website, but I believe that this covers everything that we wanted to try and cover. Let me take us out of screen share. And any comments? Marjorie?
For me, the editor interview was, I guess, the most evocative of my experience and what Jung has meant to me in my life. I should say I usually say it kind of glibly, but it's true. I was raised strict atheist. Both my parents started out as science majors. They both switched to English later. And I don't think they certainly didn't intend it. They thought it would be liberating for me and it was their response to World War II, actually. And because they just felt that, religion usually led to war, and this, the separations between people. But to have absolutely no religion, I think, was damaging. And I ended up very, very, very depressed in my mid-teens. I was very precocious, and I was introduced to Buddhism at that point. And for me, it wasn't good for me. So I was coming out of that void that Jung and Edinger are talking about, and the meaninglessness of it. And what I like about Jung is I feel that he turns it inside out. He turns religion back into something vital and real that isn't what the religious people are talking about or promulgating as dogma. I feel like he brings it back to its living source, regardless of which religion is being looked at. And when people came to him for analysis, his first step would be to send them back to the religion they had grown up in, if it was at all possible. And then if they absolutely couldn't go back, or they tried and it just didn't work for them, he'd say, okay, then we'll do the analysis. But he felt that was like the most organic way to be connected to what I want to call the unity, which some religions are more symbolic about and other religions are more straightforward about. I feel the Eastern religions tend to be more straightforward about this more abstract unity, whereas the Western religions tend to personify it. But I think looked at as a symbolic language, the Bible is incredibly rich. But we don't normally read it that way. And so for me, it was this amazing realization. It's like, well, it is true, but it's true in a completely different way than I think even a lot of clergy intended. But that shouldn't lock us out from it. I think we can get back to it in a 21st century way that's alive again, because the archetypes are alive and they live through us. I thought at first, well, that we live, you can look at your chart or something, or just think about your life and discover which archetype really describes your patterns, your soul's code, as Hillman would say. But it's really like they're writing our lives, not the other way around. And it took me a long time to see that they do have this objective existence that's larger than us. And we have these delusions of understanding and control and thinking that we can just conquer it all or manage it all or fix it. So for me, it was a kind of salvation that wasn't going back to standard religion the way it's normally presented, but an experience. And I think it's a symbolic, poetic way of describing, as they said, psychic realities that are really true. In a deeper sense, and here I'm glad Bud tuned in, that Joseph Campbell would say, that the myths aren't telling us lies, they're telling us real truths. So for me, that was just an illumination that I've always been incredibly grateful for. And I wish there was more understanding of what he was saying. And, it could be a premise to create art from, all kinds of, it could be celebrated, it could be expressed, it could be lived in all kinds of real ways. That religion has given birth to most of the terrible war that we've experienced on the planet, but also the most amazing art. Particularly music. And that's something that my parents always had. I said my father built hi-fis, and I know it was religious for them on Christmas Eve to listen to Bach. And my father could go to an incredibly deep place listening to Beethoven for hours. And for my mother, it was Mozart. For me, it was Bach. Because it was inevitable, and nobody was telling you what to believe and what to think and what to eat on Friday, or you can only eat this with that, all the kosher rules. But then again, I think kosher is a kind of mindfulness about where things come from. And is it a waste to eat animal flesh and animal products at the same time? And I think most of us don't even think about, well, where did it come from? But I was wondering, I'm having some trouble breathing, if Judith would like to share anything, particularly on the Edgar Casey segment of it.
Everybody's muted, so hit the unmute. Just hit the space bar. You'll unmute. Yeah.
Okay. I don't relate strictly with Edgar Casey because I was raised in the church from the time I was 5, but I had a lot of questions. I didn't get answers, or the answers that I did get didn't fit in here. And so I started all the different religions, Edgar Casey, this one, that one, the other. And by doing all the different religions, I've come to, with the Bible, I had a terrible time with it. As you said, a lot of it I didn't believe, a lot of it because it didn't make sense. But studying the other religions, I had my cat on my lap and he finally got down. It brought all of it together. Like with Judaism, when you get to a certain age, you can study the Kabbalah. Okay, astrology, the chakras, everything is all through the Bible, but we don't see it, we aren't taught it. But if you study all, you can see it. And, different ones in Bible study, oh, well, you're not supposed to look at astrology. It tells you, well, it's all through the book, but they don't see it. And then a lot of times I don't know what to say because I don't want to disrupt their belief, or I have a big family and I try to keep my mouth shut because one is trying to save me over here, one's trying, oh, you shouldn't be doing that, you're going to hell. And I don't believe in all of that. And I can get into arguments very easily. And right now, I'm reading this. This is.
I couldn't read it. What does it say?
Yahweh. It's the book of knowledge. It's the book of knowledge, the keys of Enoch. Now, I read this back in 2015. A lot of it I didn't understand. After the last 3 years, rereading it, it's like an eye-opener. And he's saying this happened back when. Well, it looks like it's happening all over again. with your mRNA, the DNAs, and everything that's going on. You know, you in the Bible, you talk about Moses climbing the mountain. Or the average person is thinking of a mountain. I'm thinking of meditation. He's climbing the mountain in meditation, where the average person isn't thinking that.
Consciousness.
Right. So, I mean, I can see a lot more, but I wish they would teach it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's my, you know, most people aren't looking for it. I'm looking for it. And I read a lot, but then I will get something from this book and something from that book. And and then it's, well, you know, it didn't come out of this book. But so, I mean, Edgar Cayce, he gives you more insight, but I really got more out of studying all the religions than just studying him.
Mhm. Thank you.
And, you know,
I'm just sensitive about the time. Does anybody else want to chime in? Any comments?
I'll put a couple of cents in there. You know, like you were saying, Judith, with the family and all of their strong feelings, I've historically had extremely negative reactions to fundamentalist religious expression, without regard to which religion it is. The fierce fundamentalist perspective, I always found very abrasive. I now find it somewhat less abrasive through the help of Joseph Campbell, who I walked away from reading with a tacit understanding that the purpose of religion for most people is to provide a roadmap from cradle to grave. And for those people who find comfort in having that roadmap and living strictly within the confines of that roadmap, that's great for them. You know, if that serves them, then that's a wonderful thing for them. I, on the other hand, don't want anybody to give me a roadmap for how I should live my life. I prefer a discovery process of what works for me and what doesn't work. So I like to hear new ideas, gain new concepts, and digest them and distill them down to choices that I will make for my own life and mechanisms for me to figure out how to think about different things. I don't want to hear, and I resent being told how I should think about things and what I should and shouldn't do. I don't want anything to do with that. But in keeping going back to Jung, one of the things that I find, you know, rather, I don't understand how to process it in light of what I see as a big picture for Jung. I don't really understand religion, like you were saying that he would recommend that people just go back to the religion they grew up with if they are amenable to that, and I can see that in terms of what I was saying earlier. If that roadmap will work for them, and they're content with that, well, great. That's the fastest, easiest, simplest way to go. But I don't, you know, in terms of an explanation of the psyche, I have a harder time visiting that as being meaningful. You might have the Bible or the expression of any religion metaphorically providing a lot of food for thought and a lot of, as you put it, Marjorie, truths that one can extrapolate from these various stories, that's well and good, but it doesn't need to be in a religious context. If you read a good novel and it has these metaphors that you find meaningful, that resonate for you, it doesn't need to be within a religious context. To me, the religion is really dictating how you're supposed to live. And gaining the metaphor from that context, to me, isn't a first choice place to go. You know, the fact that you can gain something from anywhere, from any context, I'm amenable to that, I'm open to that, but specifically going there for that purpose, there are a lot of other choices of places I can go. You know, I don't need to choose that one, you know.
Yeah, no, that's good, Steve. I interpreted the statement about, you know, again, you have to remember Jung has seen people that are troubled, okay? So one of the ways to help them is to start them off at some place where they're comfortable. And usually they're comfortable with the faith that they were raised in. So they can start there, but then they have to evolve from that. And that's how I interpreted it. Not that they should adopt it wholeheartedly, but it was just, they're floundering. They're in the deep end of the pool. And so, you know, whenever we try and do, you know, a group of people meeting, usually the best thing to do is to ask each person to talk about themselves, because that's something they're comfortable with. So anyway.
Now, I think the alienation of the past like 200 years is a unique situation. Maybe not, but it just seems like it.
Yeah. But Bud wanted to say something. Go ahead, Bud.
So according to Father Emmett, who was one of the most amazing Bible scholar I've ever met, you know, you ask him a question about the Bible and he'd go look it up in the Greek Bible, because even though he probably knew the answer, he wouldn't trust his own memory. That there's 4 different ways, you know, every piece of scripture, there's at least 4 different ways you can interpret it. The other thing is with Jesus, it changes the whole covenant with God. So if you love God and love your neighbor, you fulfilled all of the Jewish laws. That changes everything. Judith made an interesting comment about astrology in the church. Is that there's at least 4 different schools of astrology that I know of, and they have a problem with predictive astrology, knowing the future. About predicting the future. And Marge, I love it. You know, I know you have a problem with Joseph Campbell and the male, the sexism there, but I think he evolved. You know, it was only like in 1969 that Yale and Trinity went co-ed, and he passed away in 1988. So at that time, we, you know, the guys, you know, we're still trying to evolve into feminist thinking, and I think he was ahead of the curve on that. He made his icons, you know, we identify with because they're universal, and it's just like Jung just blows me away, and I love listening to Joseph Campbell and his understanding of it, because I think Jung was just so far out there. Joseph Campbell helps me understand Jung.
Sure.
I thought it was interesting that Jung, the video that talked about him at maybe the age of 3, I think, where it seemed what the video was suggesting is that he really had an encounter with the devil through his, you know, dreams, and I thought that was so interesting that it was so profound for him that it sort of was the foundation for him to do all this exploration, which is pretty amazing that the devil brought all this amazing stuff out.
Right. Bruce, you want to say anything? You're muted. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, okay. I know it's all intellectualization of everything. It's kind of doesn't register with me very well. It's because I've had so many inner type of experiences. One of them being that I'm telepathic. And so when you're telepathic, you see the mind in a very different way. So that's my kind of
it's a good point.
yeah.
Did you like the golden flower and the Tao?
Well, the thing with the golden flower is a lot of things that they talk about in it are not of my own experience. So the way he talked about it, I might have experienced it, but I had a different experience of it altogether or something.
Sure.
So I didn't really follow it that well, to be honest.
No, I understand. Okay, it's late. I'm just sensitive about the time. So thank everybody for coming, and we'll reconvene next week and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Happy May Day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night.